Hello, and welcome to Beyond Japan, an interdisciplinary podcast that looks at the broad reach of Japanese studies from within and beyond Japan. This podcast is brought to you by the Center for Japanese Studies at the University of East Anglia in collaboration with the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures. I'm your host, Oliver Moxham, Project Coordinator at the Center for Japanese Studies and researcher of Japanese war heritage. This week we are joined by Dr Sherzod Muminov, lecturer in Japanese history at the University of East Anglia, with whom I will be touching on the histories of empire and war. We hope you enjoy the show. Hi Sherzod, thank you for joining us on the show.
Thanks, Ollie, for organizing it.
I would like to start off by asking, how did you get into Japan's war history?
Thanks. It's a good question. I was a master's student in Tsukuba in Japan, in Ibaraki Prefecture, and I was mostly spending a lot of my time basically learning the language and trying to read as much as I could in Japanese. And I enjoyed reading history-related books or history-related sources. I think it was a combination of some advice from my teachers. Professor Harald Kleinschmidt was a historian himself, but he used to teach history of international relations. And because I was doing an international studies degree, I was very interested in how the world we have now, or the world we study, the world events that are happening now, are what is the background? How did this all come to be? Kind of questions. And at the time, I decided to do a PhD. And when it came to the topic, it was quite obvious that I would be heavily reliant on a history-related topic, or if not history itself. At the time, I hadn't imagined that I would become a historian, to be honest, because I was doing an area studies master's degree. And Professor Kleinschmidt basically advised me, well, you have to use the languages that you have, and the linguistic abilities basically will guide you in the choice of your topic and in what you want to do. Obviously, you should also be interested in the topic itself, passionate about it. So I decided initially to write about war memory in the Soviet Union and in Japan. Then, of course, it was very broad, as many topics or as many proposals in their early stages are. And I ended up actually looking more deeply into not just the history of bilateral relations, but also some more complex processes which happened, or which accompanied, if you like, Japan's transition from empire into post-war nation state.
And what links did you find between the war memory of the Soviet Union and Japan? Initially,
I set out thinking about a comparative framework, but then I think it was a bit undercooked, if that's the word. Basically, it was a very broad interest in how a certain experience, and in these two cases, the experience was quite different, as you well know, how an experience of a traumatic collective undertaking, for example, a war, shapes a nation state, or how it then informs certain narratives or certain discourses in that nation's making or remaking. So that was the big question. I very quickly understood that probably I was trying to compare something very difficult to compare. I then moved on, as it evolved, I moved to look into more general things, not necessarily attempt a direct head-to-head comparison, but look at maybe some underlying causes. And my contention would be, if I could prove it, and because I was approaching it at the time from a political science or kind of very theoretical perspective, was that there must be some common experiences, regardless of whether the experience of the war was positive, as in the case of the Soviet Union, or negative. I mean, positive, I say, of course, in a very general sense. victorious, let's say, victorious in the Soviet Union or defeated in the Japanese case. But I think the next change in the topic, and the next change, basically the thing that guided me towards what I ended up doing, was the PhD program. I was admitted to Cambridge University Faculty of Department of East Asian Studies, Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. And in conversations with my supervisor, in the initial conversations, I realized that I think I should be more concrete, and that I realized that I will probably write a historical, a purely historical, based on archives, PhD. And that's when I found this very interesting, to me it sounded quite mysterious at the time, quite an interesting question of why is the history, or historiography, if you like, of Soviet-Japanese relations, or of the links of interactions between these nations, not necessarily on the national level, but on other levels, why is it so centered around the issue of territorial dispute, the Northern Territories dispute, as it's called in Japan? I understood why it was important, but I couldn't understand why almost everything written on the history, on the post-war history, in one way or another revolved, or it seemed to me revolved around this topic. So that's how I then tried to find maybe an alternative topic, a topic of comparable importance, a topic that was, in a way, I won't say it was ignored or neglected, but it was seen as maybe resolved, something that was resolved on the state level after the signing of the Joint Declaration in 1956, which restored diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and Japan. I think the view was, and again, following the tradition of mainly nation-centered, state-centered history that once again dominates Soviet-Japanese historiography, in the English language at least. In that tradition, simply because the Soviets and the Japanese signed a declaration and restored relations, the episode of Siberian internment, and this is the topic of my book, of 600,000 Japanese captured in Manchuria and the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin, and moved to the Soviet camps and kept there anywhere between a few months and 11 years. This topic then it is seen, if you like, as done and dusted, as consigned to history. So my contention then was, why do you not talk about this? Because this might be resolved on the state level, but it's left very important legacies. But it also, besides its legacies, besides its some living imprints that it left on the Japanese national memory, collective memory, on the Japanese society, there are living people. There are survivors, witnesses, who are still alive. And at the time, obviously, at the beginning of the 2010s, when I started my PhD, they were younger than they are now. But even now, the average age of the survivor being 95, even now there are quite a few of these survivors remaining. So it was a combination for me of many things. But I became very interested in this topic, and I ended up devoting my whole PhD, and now it became a book to that topic.
Mm. And I'm sure you've faced this question many times over the course of your academic career, but what makes this research worthy of study, in your opinion?
Thanks. I think this research, this particular topic, which covers about 11 years. Obviously, the event itself lasted about 11 years. I located in broad context, both temporal context and geographical context. So I don't just focus on the 11 years in this book. I look back into the Japanese Empire, and the roots of the internment are firmly located in the empire, in the imperial expansionism into Manchuria, onto the mainland, and of course that then its legacies continue up to this day. But this event itself is just one strand or one episode, if you like, or one encounter in a broader history of Japan's empire, but not just Japan's empire. I would locate Japanese imperial experience in yet broader contexts, in the clashes between, on one hand, the so-called Western powers and Japan for primacy in East Asia. I also like to think about the Japanese and the Soviet challenges. Maybe that's too strong a word, but Japan and Soviet Union's revolt against the supremacy of the West in the 1930s, which is very strangely comparable, I think, which are very strangely comparable, despite the fact that this was also a time of mutual, between the Soviets and the Japanese, mutual mistrust, mutual apprehension, especially along some borders. So I would also like to see this very turbulent period in which Japan tries to build its empire in every sense, obviously in terms of influence over other areas or over other peoples, in terms of industrial might and military might. We can see how imperial thinking evolved to coincide with the expansion on the land. I mean, the physical, geographical expansion was always accompanied with a certain lag by an expansion in thinking, an expansion in the idea of the empire that is getting bigger, it's getting more inclusive, or it had to be more inclusive. And of course, it faced clashes. It was born out of the clashes between those who thought that we need what Kate MacDonald has called cultural pluralism in the empire, in which the Koreans and the Taiwanese and other the subjects that have newly joined the empire are seen as equal parts of the imperial fabric. But on the other hand, there is a more reactionary, if you like, or a more conservative camp, which says, no, Japanese empire, it has to be Japanese at its core. So, but then that clash is just one clash among many. And this massive undertaking of the Japanese empire has, I think, personally, and I hope it is reflected in my research, hasn't been actually done justice by over the past few decades, although that is changing, and more scholarship, very exciting scholarship on the Japanese empire is coming out by the nation state or national framework in the post-war period. Because in the post-war, for obvious political reasons, not just domestic political reasons, but for foreign policy or international political reasons, nation state comes to the fore. And the post-war Japanese nation state it presents itself, I'm not saying it was, as an ethnically homogeneous, ethnically exclusivist to an extent. Tessamura Suzuki has written about this in her book about Cold War Japan and migration, in which yesterday's subjects, who were quite aggressively subsumed quite aggressively integrated into the empire by, for example, the Kominka policies and other policies, are suddenly third country nationals. Of course, the US occupation did play a part in this too. So what I am getting at, I guess, if I make it short, the empire was a multinational, multi-ethnic, transnational, multi-border, uh, multi-regional undertaking. It was massive. It was very short-lived, but that didn't mean that it didn't leave traces. It didn't. It actually, in every sphere or in every realm of society, it left its nets. It cast a net over the territory, however shortly, and trying to squeeze that all into one very small framework and kind of abandon everything else, abandon all the institutions, the traditions, the migrations, the exchanges, the thinking, all of that in favor of a narrowly defined, ethnically homogeneous nation state. I think it does the topic a little bit of injustice.
I see. Having talked about the scholarship, this lens through which you've done this research of Japanese empire, it seems very much wrapped up in war as well. It seems very difficult to extract one from the other. And as such, in my own experience of researching Japanese war heritage, I find that narratives within Japan of empire are usually associated with war museums, but are also very domestically focused and don't really discuss Japan's overseas colonizing efforts. In short, I was just wondering, how is this transnational view of Japanese empire received in Japan itself?
Certainly, over the past decades, that perception has changed, and it is changing dynamically. There is a lot of new research on the Japanese empire in Japanese from different angles. What is really interesting, what is really important, I think, is that the empire, perhaps because of the distance, temporal distance, because of 75 years roughly, well, if we can, of course, trace it further back, the empire itself, but let's say if we take 15th of August 1945 as the date when the empire collapsed, it's quite a long period, roughly one human's lifetime. And I like to think that this distance enabled scholars, but not just scholars, but broader commentators in the Japanese society to be able to tackle empire, to be able to bring empire back from this. I'm not going to use the word neglect, and it will be too long a conversation if we really dig too deep into the reasons why the empire was left out from most scholarship, especially in the early post-war periods. But it was left out. Scholars have used the term imperial erasure, as if the empire was completely erased from not only the pages of history, but also consciousness of the people, the collective memory of the people. The empire was maybe, if not willfully erased, willfully avoided, then it was probably not emphasized enough. And I think the guilt, the war guilt, and the negative memories of the war, the war responsibility issues, which are quite complex, and they don't just concern domestic Japanese public, because they have colored, as you well know, Japan's relations with its former victims and neighbors. So this issue has had very difficult and very unpleasant baggage attached to it, which is understandable to an extent, because empire was a big failure. The fallen empire is not something you are proud of and you want to remember. However, I think one thing we should do as historians, at least, is we should detach empire from the emotional and what's the word? Maybe we shouldn't always look at empire based on the value judgments, but see it as a historical phenomenon. We should see it as an undertaking. You can look at it as a huge logistical undertaking. Just look at, for example, all the vessels that used to transport people between Japan, the metropole, and the colonies. Or you might want to look at the volume of rice imported from Korea and Taiwan. You might want to look at the bureaucracy and how this bureaucracy was shaped and how it was then adapted to the needs of every colony. You might want to look at architecture. Bill Sewell has written a wonderful book about Japanese in Changchun. And however unpleasant or however difficult and however complex these issues, these legacies of the empire are, I think it is really important to look into these legacies and into the traces of the empire, because they're everywhere, and they shape not only the way, not only very consciously, but also unconsciously, the way in which the past is constructed in people's imaginations. Very differently, I'm sure, as a British person, you will know that empire is seen very differently in this country. And the contrast is very telling. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, you can see how what kind of emotions the word empire brings out in people's minds in both countries. But for a moment, at least as professional historians, we should leave those emotions alone and focus on this large undertaking, transnational, multi-ethnic undertaking that stretched across sea and land. And I think that's what the Japanese historians are starting to do. Well, they have been doing it for a while, but there is a lot more interesting research coming out. And in Japan, while the perception of empire has not fundamentally changed, at least the intellectual realm is I think becoming more and more aware and readier to face the empire and to dig deep into the imperial history. And it is reflected also in Anglophone scholarship, because I think the last decade has seen a very good number of quite a big number of very exciting, interesting books that look at various aspects of empire. And I'm very happy to, when my book comes out, hopefully, to see my own work as part of that wave of new research that prioritizes not what we used to look at as, especially if you come from international relations, you look at the nation as the unit of global politics, of world politics. So without specifically being preoccupied with the state or the nation, there is so much new research that actually analyzes things that go beyond the state or that happen despite the state. And I think that is also happening in Japanese and Anglophone scholarship on the empire.
You compared earlier the different reception of the idea of empire over here in Britain as compared with Japan. And I'm just curious, how does Japan's imperial history fit into postcolonial studies, which has so often been focusing on the Western empires, which, comparatively speaking, existed for much longer and also have more history out of wartime than Japan's empire might?
It's a very difficult question, but it's also really interesting. And I hope this comparison, this broad transnational comparison, can be done at some point. Krishan Kumar has written a book about empires which is a very well-written, very enjoyable read. I was very disappointed not to find Japanese empire among the empires that he looks at. If we locate the Japanese colonial experience and post-colonial experience in this broad context, we see probably several trends. One trend would be, and again, this links to how empire was perceived immediately after the war in Japan itself. Because of Japan's defeat and because the empire's ultimate failure on all fronts, but especially because of the US occupation that happened, Allied occupation but dominated by the United States, in the immediate aftermath of defeat, the empire and the responsibility for it, and the responsibility for its colonies, for all the apparatuses that were constructed by the empire, that were necessitated by the everyday running of this behemoth that stretched thousands of miles across land and sea. All of this was seen, at least within the Japanese society, as something that was exacted from the outside. That because for 7 years Japan is run, of course, in collaboration with local Japanese politicians, with the Japanese government. However, most of the decisions were taken by the US occupation administration. So all of this is seen as it's out of our hands, kind of. So we see a certain rupture, at least when it comes to colonies. And that rupture was beyond any doubt enforced by the Allies. Of course, it's not just the United States. The Japanese empire was dismantled. Of course, it was defeated initially, but what happens after the empire is gone? What happens after the Japanese themselves are completely taken out of the equation by the Allies, in the sense that Japan doesn't really play, at least politically, any role in how its former colonies are administered. And this is a very interesting comparison that you can make, for example, with Britain, France. I'm not going to give you a definitive answer or a comparison, but I think some, at least on the political level, there is this very clear difference. However, that difference can be then cancelled out by some of the other links or some of the other legacies that survive in other realms. Let's just look at, for example, the economic realm, the realm of trade, in which Japan dominates after some time, especially from the period of high speed economic growth. Japan becomes a very significant economic player in the areas where it used to have its empire, or it has growing influence over the areas, growing economic influence, growing trade links and other networks, supply networks, that very interestingly coincide with what used to be Japanese empire. So it's not totally or completely something that was constructed after the war. There has been a lot of interesting research. The late Aaron Stephen Moore wrote a book about empires post-war links. After the empire has gone, has collapsed, he talks about Japanese infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia, for example. There's been other research that traces post-war relations or post-war links with some of the seeds, if you like, that were planted during the empire. Carter Eckert spoke about Pak Geun-hye, for example. And there are so many other ways in which you can actually see that the empire didn't really go away. It didn't completely go away. It kept resurfacing like this behemoth or leviathan that continues to resurface, continues to come up to the surface of the ocean, in which you see some traces, some of its features, some of its phantoms, maybe, and which you can't really say that this was completely gone or this was completely erased by the United States or by the Cold War requirements. So in a way, Cold War requirements actually helped revive those ties, but obviously for a different purpose.
I think you only have to look at heritage studies and Japan's dominance in UNESCO to see another way in which the Japanese Empire has re-emerged in a different form. But there's so much more we could talk about, but I'm afraid we're running a bit short on time. Before we wrap things up, I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about your books, Dismantling Japan's Empire and Overcoming Empire in Post-Imperial Asia.
Thank you. These are 2 volumes that I co-edited with my supervisor, PhD supervisor, and long-term collaborator, Professor Brad Kushner. These 2 books deal with a plethora of issues, some of which I've just mentioned. I've just talked about post-imperial East Asia or post-imperial Asia in general. These books have been born out of the ERC project, European Research Council project, the dissolution of the Japanese Empire, which was led by Professor Kushner. And I was a researcher on that project. And the overarching theme or idea behind both these volumes and the broader research project was that we tend to stop analyzing Japanese Empire on August 15, 1945. That is one big problem. Another big problem is that we tend to look at it mainly from the Japanese or even American viewpoint or Anglophone viewpoint, and that Japanese-American, US-Japan alliance has a disproportionate influence on our thinking about Japanese post-war history, that we should actually link Japan back into Asia. And I think these 2 volumes, they do that through bringing new scholarship. Much of the scholarship in these 2 volumes are Japanese or East Asian scholars who've never published in English before. But of course, there are other scholars who've worked on various aspects of Japan's empire and imperial legacies. So the lens that we use in these volumes is not simply just through Japan or about Japan. We have very forcefully argued, actually, especially in the second volume, Overcoming Empire, that you can study Japanese empire and not be solely focused on Japan itself. This actually is another proof of how pervasive and how far-reaching some of the legacies and some of the institutions and structures of the empire were. And there is also a third volume, which Professor Kushner has co-edited with my colleague Andrew Levitis, which also continues the theme. It's titled In the Wake of the Empire. And these 3 volumes, which I have contributed to, we hope that they basically diversify our ideas or our thinking about Japan's empire, not only from the Japanese perspective, but also from the perspective of its former subjects or former occupied territories, and that it brings a rich gamut of research and possibilities and angles through which to look at this very difficult, understudied in English process of transition, very painful transition from empire to post-empire in Japan and in East Asia in general.
Sounds fascinating. Clearly a burgeoning field of research, and I look forward to watching grow. Thank you for your time, Sherzod. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Ollie.
You can find links to Sherzod's research profile in the description below. If you would like to tackle the challenging field of transnational imperial history with Sherzod, check out the Researching Japan module of our new MA in Interdisciplinary Japanese Studies. Beyond Japan will be taking a break as the university prepares for the next academic year. We will be back with new episodes in September, and we hope you join us then. Thank you for listening.